I am Alan Light, and Danyel Smith is an author, award-winning journalist, and producer. She has written 2 novels, More Like Wrestling and Bliss, and she's the creator and host of the Spotify-exclusive Black Girl Songbook, a music and talk show that centers Black women in music. A 2021 Yaddo Fellow, Danyel was a senior producer and editor at ESPN and a John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford, where she co-founded Hardcover, an innovative culture magazine. In addition to writing for NPR, the California Sunday Magazine, the New Yorker, Teen Vogue, and the New York Times, Danyel has served as editor of Billboard, editor-at-large at Time Inc., and editor-in-chief of Vibe magazine. Her latest book is Shine Bright, A Very Personal History of Black Women in Pop. Danyel Smith. And Kelefa Sanneh has been a New Yorker staff writer since 2008, before which he spent 6 years as a pop music critic at the New York Times. Did you guys overlap, or is that in sequence?
We did not.
He is also a contributor to CBS Sunday Morning. Previously, he was the deputy editor of Transition, a journal of race and culture based at Harvard University. His writing has also appeared in a number of magazines and books, including Shake It Up, Great American Writing on Rock and Pop from Elvis to Jay-Z, and in a number of installments of the Da Capo Best Music Writing series. His most recent book, out in paperback this week, is Major Labels, A History of Popular Music in 7 Genres. Kelefa Sanneh.
Thanks.
So there's interesting ways that you guys doing very different projects, ways that these things sort of connect and ways that they do different things. But the first thing I wanted to ask both of you to talk about is these are both deeply researched histories, but there is also a lot of memoir, of personal stuff that's in here. And how did you determine and why did you determine to bring yourself into the stories that you were going to tell? And Danny, I'm going to make you talk first because I know this was a big sort of ongoing issue for you figuring out this book.
It was. Sometimes I feel like that's the question about both of our books. It was not an easy first of all, hi everybody, thanks for coming out in the rain, it's much appreciated. I wanted to write from the beginning a very straightforward history of Black women in pop music. I feel like the women themselves are underserved. I feel like the fans of the women are underserved. I feel like these women are the loves of my life. So I was like, let's go, let's get it done. Let's do like a nice, I don't know how many people have read When and Where I Enter from Paula Giddings about just the impact of Black women on race and politics, I think it is. In any case, that book is in my heart always, and I kind of wanted to do that, but for Black women in music. But I was not getting done. It just literally was not getting done, and I'm happy to be sitting here with Alan, who used to be my boss at Vibe, and I think Alan knows I'm a pretty timely person with regard to deadline. I wasn't
She's very good.
I appreciate that. And I wasn't getting done. And I had some talks with my editor, Chris Jackson, and he said to me, you know, you're just gonna have to claim your space as a Black woman in music. I was like, ooh, okay. Do you want me to use the pronoun I in the book? He said, I think you should consider it. And once I did consider it, and once I started thinking, well, what I'll do is, instead of trying to include everybody, which is what slowed me down, I was so dumbly kind of afraid of having to answer to the masses of, well, why didn't you include this one? Where's Mary J. Blige? Like, how come you didn't put, you know what I mean? This one is, you have a big, you know, chapter on Ella Fitzgerald, but where's Nancy Wilson, even though I did get Nancy Wilson in small ways. I said, listen, I'm gonna focus on the women that have meant the most to me and my sister. For me personally and professionally, I'm going to focus on the women who have meant the most to my mother and my mother's sister and their friends. I am going to focus the most on the Black women in music who most mattered to my grandmother and her sisters and my grandmother's friends. And then all of a sudden I had a book.
Simple as that. Flip the switch. And Kay, for you, what was you got a lot of history to cover,
That's
but
right.
also to get where your story enters that.
Well, I got to say, so first of all, for me, it's really cool to be up here with you and Danielle. I've been learning about music from both of you since the 90s. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, Danielle, congratulations. This is an awesome book. I read it over the weekend, loved it, learned a lot from it. And the way you talked about how you see the world and why this stuff matters to you and why these artists matter to you, I think helps us hear, even those of us that think we know a little something about music, helps us hear that music in a different way and hear that identification, hear what you hear in it. And I was thinking about that slightly selfishly also because my book, it's not exactly the opposite of that, but your book, you write in such a moving way about that process of identification, about that idea of similarity, about this is my music, this is what I love, this is where I feel at home. And for me, I first started caring about music through punk rock as a teenager. And for me, loving music was inseparable from hating music. For me, loving music was partly like, I love this punk rock stuff, and I hate all this other stuff. And in fact, the fact that punk rock is giving me license to say I hate these other bands is part of what was appealing to me about it. Now, of course, over the years I came to decide that, Bob Marley doesn't suck, like the Rolling Stones are pretty good. But like when I was in high school, that was such a revelation to be like, whatever all those other kids are listening to, it's trash, it's bad. Not just aesthetically bad, it's like morally bad.
It's wrong.
It's wrong. Like that was what was so exciting to me about punk rock. And so I wanted the book to a little bit echo my own journey, which is that as I got into punk rock and I'm like, okay, I'm only listening to punk, I'm not listening to anything that's punk rock, it's got to follow the punk rules. Then, beyond a certain point, I was like, well, if punk rock's about breaking the rules, then like the most punk rock thing you could do would be to like break the rules of punk rock, whether that be through dance music, whether that be through getting obsessed with hip hop, because hip hop has some of that punk spirit. But then it's like, well, if the punk spirit is kind of defiant, then maybe the most punk thing you could do would be to listen to some music that was like radically unpunk. And so for me, that helped me hear, smooth R&B. That helped me hear like beautifully crafted Nashville country music. And so to me, learning to love all these different genres, and my book is kind of organized around these genres, organized around rock and roll, R&B, country, punk rock, hip hop, dance music, and pop. To me, that was partly a process of figuring out like, well, what do I like and what do I hate? And what do other people like? What do other people hate? And my theory is that for many of us, loving music is partly related to hating music, which is to say, loving music is a way to get closer to this thing that you kind of want to be, but it's also a way to set yourself apart from other people and from other kinds of music, right? I like this thing more than that thing because I'm the kind of person who listens to this and I'm not the kind of person who listens to that. At least I'm not that kind of person right now. In an hour, I may change my mind.
Well, I want to come back to that because that sort of tribalism thing is a thing I've thought about a lot, and I think there's a lot to do with that. But the step in between here and there, I think, is you started to speak to this, but what did going through the process of writing these, for each of you, writing these books, what did you learn? What did you discover about your own relationship to music, about what it is that, why we care so damn much about this stuff? What did immersing yourself in it in this way, turn up that was new for you?
I like way more than I thought I did. I think is so important for me to have learned. Also, so many musics I have spent years being, for one reason or another, scared of. Very scared of opera. It just seemed big and white and like it wasn't inviting me to whatever party it was. I didn't care that there were some black people singing it, operatically, classically, however we want to talk about it. I had gone on tours of the Met, and it all just seemed very closed off. But then I began to think even more deeply about music than I usually do, and I started thinking about how the whole pop surge in America during the whole opera surge in America during the 1950s really set the tone for so much of the American pop that came after it. That I was like, I'm gonna have to listen to it, and I'm gonna have to listen to it because Leontine Price is related to Dionne Warwick, who is related to Cissy Houston, who is, of course, Whitney Houston's mother. I believe in going to the primary source whenever I can, and I started listening particularly to Leontine Price. And as the kids say, I got my whole life. I did. I am never so happy as when I am learning about a new kind of music, a new artist, a new song, hear a chorus or a hook in a different way. And so listening to Leontine sing opera and hearing Mississippi in her voice still, and I had these kind of moments over and over again during the course of writing Shine Bright. And to me, that's what keeps me happy about the book. You get to be in your 50s and you think, well, you know what? I like what I like, and
I know what I know.
I know what I know, and I'm not listening to that. And I'm so happy to not feel that way at all, and to still always, right now even, I'm on the search for the next thing.
And did you know that about yourself going in? I mean, was that?
No,
Yeah.
I didn't. I mean, if we're talking about tribes, I graduated from the Motown tribe into the hip hop tribe. So yeah, I was jumped in the Motown gang by my parents, my mother and her sisters. It's like, you're gonna like this. This is what you're gonna do. Hip hop at its inception was so in need of defenders. Hip hop at its inception was so in need of people to love it, to report around it, to experience it, hoping for artistic merit. It was in need of me, and I was happy to be of service at the highest levels. But it always makes me so happy, as I said, to know that that is not all of me. For many years at a time, 2-3 years at a time, it could literally be all that I listen to is rap and R&B. And I love it, and I feel guilty saying out loud sometimes, but that's just not all that I like, though. As much as I was raised on Motown, I was raised on Elvis. Alan and I have talked about this at length. He kind of helped me through that chapter and to get right with being the Black Elvis fan that I am. So I love the fact that there's still things in front of me and still things around me also that I've kind of dipped my toe into, and now that I could just, skinny dip in, even now.
And for you, Kay, what would you discover through all this?
Well, so I set out, part of the reason I set out to write a book about genres was to be annoying, because there is this idea that maybe genres aren't as important as there used to be, right? Like maybe back in the day, the record stores had literally different parts of the stores for different records, and maybe now it's the Spotify age, and everything's all mixed up, and Lil Nas X is every single different genre at once, and everyone's listening to everything. So part of what I wanted to do was go back and make an argument for the importance of genres, but I also wanted to think about how genres have worked through history. And one of the things that I learned that kind of surprised me and, to be honest, delighted me is that this moment that it felt like we were in, this Spotify moment, this moment of everything's mixed together and everyone's listening to the same Post Malone or Beyonce or whatever, it's all mixed up. It's not an unprecedented thing. It's something that happens again and again in the last half century of popular music, especially in America. You think about the disco era, which is this great coming together, right? The idea is that everyone can be together on the dance floor, and these great R&B singers are going to be the prime movers, but you're also going to have, rock bands making disco records, and Star Wars makes a disco record, and these European producers and these Latin band leaders are getting into it, and all this different stuff is coming together. That was a moment that in some ways is like this moment, a moment when some of these boundaries are starting to blur. And of course, what happens with disco is that there's a huge backlash. And not just a backlash from rock fans, a backlash from people who love dance music, right? The producers who were about to create Chicago House, they were like, we don't like Rick Dees and Disco Duck. We don't like the fact that like it's this big celebrity novelty thing that anyone's allowed into. We want to do something that's a little more pure, a little more intimate, a little more us. And so I think that I think that's something to do with human nature. Maybe that's also something to do with America, this sense that, like, beyond a certain point, when everyone gets kind of lumped together, certain people start getting a little itchy. Certain people start feeling like, no, I don't want Justin Bieber to be the face of R&B. I want some distinctions. I want things to be a little different. I want to have a way of showing the world that I'm not like everybody else. And so I think I came to see that history of popular music as kind of cyclical, and moments when things are kind of coming together, for better or for worse, where everything feels like it's becoming pop, and then moments when things are divided and getting a little more divisive, a little smaller, a little purer, and that maybe our current moment when it feels like everyone is streaming everything is just setting the stage for the next backlash, whatever that is.
We'll talk about, because at times the book almost reads as a defense of genre.
For sure.
Which, artists hate. I mean, the first thing any artist says is like, I don't think about genre.
Yeah.
Don't tell me I'm this kind of artist or that kind of artist. I just make music that's the music I want to make.
Like every time I've ever talked to an artist, right?
That's 100% the answer.
Yes, I was talking, talking to Morgan Wallen about this, and the country singer, and he's like, why can't it just be good music? That's what they all say. But
you make a case for what the importance of those sort of guardrails
yeah.
are. And you said something interesting the other week. I ran into you last week at a country show.
That's right.
And we were talking about country radio programming. So yes, people, when we're off the clock, we are just as nerdy as we are when we're right here doing. So we were talking about country radio programming, and you said
we were slightly more well-refreshed than we are right now.
Yes, I'm gonna misquote it, but you said something about country radio programming, and you kind of said, in the end, I kind of care more about the audience and what the audience thinks than what the artist thinks.
Well, yeah, I'm interested in the audience. I'm interested in what the audience loves. And of course, part of the reason why I want to defend the idea of a genre is that a genre is really a musical community. It's a community of musicians and listeners who feel like they're part of the same thing. And if you think of a genre as a musical community, then you realize that it doesn't really make that much sense to be like, oh, musical communities are going away. Like, no, we're humans. We love community. And any community is defined partly by inclusion and partly by exclusion. And you need a mixture of both to create a community. And in fact, you mentioned that it's true that when you talk to an artist about genres, artists love to be like, no, I'm making music for everyone. I don't want to be just tied to a genre. But also, artists have a tendency to get bent out of shape when they feel like they're being excluded from a genre, right? When Casey Musgraves is nominated in the pop category instead of the country category, she's like, no, wait a second, I want to be part of the country world. You saw it in Whitney Houston, right? When Whitney Houston comes out, and because her records do so well on pop radio, she is dubbed, I think was it Newsweek that called her the prom queen of soul, right? Which is like, kind of a compliment, but kind of an insult. And there was a sense that she was not closely tied enough to the R&B world, and that, that Clive Davis was going to work hard to try and establish her R&B cred, which sounds crazy now, right? Like no one would deny what Whitney Houston was, but at the time, there was this idea that R&B was a community, and she maybe wasn't as closely tied to it as she wanted to be or felt she should have been. So I think it's both. Artists want to be free to do whatever they want, but at other times, artists want to feel like they're part of a community.
Well, your project, Danny, is like into that argument and away from that argument, because it's also, you are making a case in the book, and certainly with Black Girl Songbook, for, I'm not going to say justice for these artists, but for the recognition that they deserve and have not been granted, oftentimes because of this sense of, that they're just an R&B singer, or even they're just a pop singer, doesn't necessarily get you the respect of being a great vocalist that, you know, that so many of the folks you write about deserve. So what is that, you buy what Kay is saying, or you buy part of what Kay is saying?
I buy it. I buy it.
Ish.
I buy it. I think though, just a long experience working at Billboard as R&B editor and then as editor, also just as a person who I think because of going to Billboard so early in my career has always been obsessed with Billboard and the charts and SoundScan and all of these things, and of course then the history of Billboard and the way the charts, I mean, so many of the charts just started out based in race and were used as a way to continue to segregate musical taste. It was used as a way to segregate people in record stores. It was used as a way to book shows. So it was used as a way to segregate even crowds at events. So, and there's a status attached to the different charts. And so the idea that Whitney Houston or somebody like a Whitney Houston, say a Michael Jackson or a Lionel Richie, or even a Mariah Carey, a Luther Vandross, there was a feeling that the R&B chart was a kind of a chitlin chart.
Yeah.
An N-word chart.
Race records, it used to be called.
Race records, it used to be called. And you wanted out. You wanted your freedom away from that. You wanted to be lifted up to the space of pop. I don't want to just play the hood club outside of Philly. I want to play what used to be, I guess, the Spectrum.
Or Marvin Gaye saying, I don't want to be playing for R&B crowds at all. I want to be at the Copa playing for white Republicans.
I mean, it's Ella Fitzgerald basically saying, listen, if you aren't going to allow, there to be an integrated crowd here at the dance hall, then Ella Fitzgerald is not playing the dance hall, which is one of the reasons, that Ella Fitzgerald is Ella Fitzgerald, but it's one of the ways that the beginnings of integrated music crowds even started. So the idea that pop is bad, and we could talk all day because I don't believe that pop is a sound ever, nor have I ever. I don't believe that there is a pop sound. I believe that there is a pop designation. And so I believe that Black artists have been denied the fruits of that designation historically. And there's some argument to be had whether or not they are still being denied those fruits.
And you quote, in your book, there's that extraordinary quote from Donna Summer in your book, right, who says that I've been categorized wrongly as a Black act. And she says, I'm not even really an R&B singer. She says, I'm a pop singer, right? She's claiming that space. And I think, but isn't this, and this...
She's claiming that space because the R&B space was made to be in her era, and the disco space after or during it as well was made to be smaller and less than. It was made to be that if she was selling tickets for a show, she had to charge $8 a ticket, where if she was a pop artist, then she could charge $25 a ticket and create the kind of generational wealth that has been denied to Black musicians in this country since pop music began.
I mean, the thing that I obviously thought of reading your book, but thought of a lot reading your book, was back when we were working on launching Vibe magazine. We, from the beginning, you and I had this conversation. I was working at Rolling Stone. You were writing for Billboard and for other places. And there was a recognition that hip hop was kind of rock and roll enough that people would make some space for it. Like, I could get hip hop acts into Rolling Stone in the early 90s, maybe not the way that I wanted, maybe not as big as I wanted, but there was room for them. There was zero room at that time. I couldn't get 200 words on Mary J. Blige into Rolling Stone at the time, and when we launched, we said, this magazine is going to live or die if we get the R&B side right. Yes. That is an empty lane because nobody is recognizing that as an important thing. Yeah. And I kept thinking about that in reading your book in terms of, where they're allowed to blur. Mm-hmm. Again, the skate kids were listening to hip hop enough, the metal kids were listening enough that there could be, okay, we'll let some of that in over here. Yeah. But the R&B and even the sort of emerging hip hop soul stuff that was happening in TLC and those acts was seen as, too black, too female, too soft to go into a rock and roll magazine.
Well, yeah, typically, you probably have the same experience, like going to concerts in New York, typically the blackest crowds you'll see are not hip-hop, typically it's R&B. And that's where, typically it's Jaheim doing the Valentine's Day show in Newark, which was
That's
epic,
a show
by the
right
way.
there.
Yeah.
That's a show right there.
But this is a fundamental tension in black music in America, right? Which is, if you're performing, there is something to celebrate about the idea of being an artist that has a mainly black audience, right? There's something about that you can take pride in. And the issue is that when you cross over, as it's called, when you go pop, then maybe you have a majority white audience. And that's something that different singers and different performers have wrestled with in different ways. What is it? Is that what you want? Do you want the majority white audience in a majority white country? What does that mean? What does that do to your identity? And are we embracing black music as an identity, as Billboard did when the R&B chart gets renamed Black Music Chart, right, in the early 80s?
And then George Michael goes #1.
Yes, and then George Michael goes #1. Or are we saying what Donna Summer says? It says, like, no, don't categorize me that way. I don't want to be that. And I think at various times, various artists have wrestled with both of those ideas.
So you, in the book, Danielle just said, a refusal to accept pop as a sound, as a style, but pop is, you address as one of the genres that you look at. What did how did you section that off and talk about pop as its own thing in the way that you talked about country or dance music or whatever?
Well, yeah, I mean, my argument is that for certainly in the 60s, pop was everything, and like the Beatles were like a pop act, and that's how they were written about. In the 70s, pop really becomes more of a pejorative. Like the Carpenters are pop because they're not rock. You're pop if you leave your home, right? You used to be an R&B singer and then you went pop. You used to be country, then you went pop. So pop kind of becomes an insult in the 70s. And in the 80s, a bunch of musicians, especially people in the UK, start to reclaim pop and say, no, this is what I am. I'm a pop star. I'm not making rock and roll. Rock and roll is boring. We're doing pop. And so I argue that in the 80s, a certain sound, which is sort of based in R&B, but has some synthesizers and electronics coming in from post-punk, and it's coming together in nightclubs, creates what a lot of people would now think of as a pop sound. I talk about Madonna as someone who, I think about a record like Borderline. It comes out of, it's kind of coming out of freestyle and coming out of all these different things that are happening, but it kind of creates this new synthesis. And so nowadays, when you talk about pop, musicians get categorized as pop, or if you talk about hyperpop, which is kind of like a sub-genre now, you have artists like Robyn, who's thought of as a pop singer, and she's not all that popular. In fact, she's not nearly as popular as like Travis Scott or something. So pop goes from being a way to designate a label that you throw at whoever is touching the mainstream to functioning a little more like a community, where if you as an artist say, I am a pop singer, there probably is a canon of influences and predecessors that you're thinking about. And whether we're talking about Robyn or Katy Perry or whoever, we're talking about a lot of people that are drawing from some of the same things. So I think that a genre can start as something that's kind of fake. It can start as a grab bag. It can start as a marketing term, and then over time kind of morph into a culture or a musical tradition.
The book sort of builds to stretching out with some longer chapters on Whitney, on Mariah, on Janet, on some of these figures that you spent a lot of time with, and talked about this stuff. What do they have to say about the things that we're talking about those questions of crossover, of pop versus whatever it is? When you're sitting particularly with those women, what do you hear from them about it?
I hear the same thing, and I hear different things from all three of them. If we're talking about Whitney, Mariah, and Janet, I hesitate to quote Whitney Houston, because Lord knows, unfortunately, she's not here to defend herself or to correct me where I'm wrong, which she has never had any problem doing. But she really looked at it as a status thing and a financial thing. She resented deeply having to go on these promotional runs before her first albums came out, pitching herself to pop radio stations who did not believe that she should be on their station because she was a black artist. She didn't like having to pitch herself to MTV for those same reasons. So she was very resentful of having to charge less for concert tickets. She did not want to so much go pop as she wanted what she felt was rightfully hers, which was to be as popular as she could possibly be in the entire world. And she felt that people were trying to keep her from that. Mariah is here to correct me where I'm wrong. And Lord knows she has and will. Again.
We have a seat for her if she's in the.
She has anything she
Believe me, if she was here, she would take it over with all of her opinions.
And I would be sitting right there listening to her.
No, I think Mariah Carey just wanted to figure out. I'm speaking of her early in her career, which is when I spent more time with her. She wanted to be black. She didn't want folks to have to guess, as we were taught to do when she was debuting. It was like with Ronnie Spector. I interviewed my aunt, who's a big Ronettes fan. I said, did you all think that the Ronettes were black? Or did you guys think they were white? Or what did you think? She said, we thought they were black. We knew they were black. We could look at them and see that they were black. My aunt was in California. She said, but the white kids we knew thought they were white and believed them to be white. That's the Mariah Carey model. She followed the Ronettes model. She was a part of it. I don't think anybody forced her. I think she probably thought it was wise at the beginning and realized quickly it was going to kill her and decided to not do it anymore. And I think with Janet Jackson is a different situation. She comes from a family that invented black pop, that invented Michael Jackson just changed absolutely everything. It's hard to talk about him these days, but he did in fact do that. And for Janet Jackson to be brave enough, honestly, not just to make it in American pop, but to compete with her brother. I just think that I don't even know how to talk about Janet. I don't think we talk about her enough. I don't think we talk about the way in which her career was stolen from her after the great Justin Gate of Super Bowl. But I do think that because you have Michael Jackson as your brother, you believe that all is possible. And so Janet Jackson did believe, and I do believe, still does believe, that she is for everything and everything is for her. And if there's anybody who believes that she is a part of no genre, I think it's Janet Demita Jo Jackson. Absolutely.
So I want to bring it back to, and soon I'm going to go see if you guys have questions and things you want to talk about. But first, I just want to bring back to where one of the places we started, which was talking about audience and how you think all of this is received. Because I know, again, the premise you were starting from is in the face of a streaming world, a blurring up, but there is no question that there is on both sides a blurring of a lot of what these genres, at least of what they mean. I mean, country records are made like hip hop records, and the chart, will make no distinction between what pop hits, country hits, and hip hop hits are, clearly all being listened to by the same kids at the same time. how do you think, again, to challenge your starting point, do you think that it is transforming, and in which way? And is that, where do you see that going? Do you see people continuing to, is that tribal sense? Is that sense of, I listen to metal, keep that pop stuff away from me, or I listen to hip hop, I don't want to hear that rock shit. Like, is that as strong a thing? Will that what version of that will we have moving ahead?
Well, so that's a good question. I think I want to say first that a lot of times when you talk about the blurring of the lines musically, right, and you think about the way that you can turn on country radio and hear what sounds like an 808 drum, and the song is maybe written to a track the way a pop song or hip hop track would be. So you get this musical blurring of the lines, sometimes accompanied by a cultural sharpening of the lines, right? Like when I saw Morgan Wallen launch his tour at Madison Square Garden, he's got songs in his set that could almost be pop songs. He's using programmed drums, and then between songs, the audience is maybe chanting "Let's Go Brandon," right? So it's more politically or culturally tribal, even as musically it's a little more blurred. And in fact, in country music, you can see how these things often go together, right? Often you have the groups that are a little more old-fashioned, right? Using mandolins and banjos and none of this newfangled stuff. Often that's like the hipster country, right? Like that might be someone in Brooklyn. And so the musicianship is old-fashioned, but the cultural identity is very kind of progressive and hipster. And then with some of the other stuff in Nashville, it's the opposite, right? Where the musical identity is very, you're doing songs with Nelly, Morgan Wallen's doing a duet with Lil Durk, Broadway Girls. So you're doing these collaborations musically, and the reason you're still in the genre is because your cultural identity is really sharp. To use Morgan as an example, I asked him about like growing up listening to country music, and he was like, I kind of grew up on like Nickelback. Like he didn't grow up like deep.
God bless him.
Yeah, and he didn't grow up deep in this musical tradition, but somehow culturally he felt like he was part of this tradition. He was like, I just started singing and it just kind of came out country. And so that's a definition of country music where it's more about the culture and you can draw in all sorts of things musically. And you've seen some of that with hip hop too, right? Like hip hop can be all sorts of things. You have all sorts of people making it. Even the idea, which seemed obvious back in the 90s, that you had to rap to be hip hop. Like now, it's pretty clear that you can sing or you can do other kind of vocal effects and it's still really hip hop. And so even as the musical rules have kind of blended and blurred, hip hop still means something. And the idea of like being hip hop it's still a thing, and there's certain figures. If I pointed to someone like Post Malone and I said, this is the definitive hip-hop figure, a lot of people in this room would be like, let's chill out for a second, right? And so there is this sense of like, no, these labels, these groups, these cultures, these communities still matter. So I don't know exactly where it's going. One thing that people would say to me when they heard about the idea of my book is that like genres are basically just like a record company plot. They're just a way that record companies try to like sell people records more efficiently by breaking us into like little demographic boxes. And I'm like, yeah, but as you both know better than I do, there's a lot of record company plots and most of them fail. And the question is, why did this one succeed so wildly? Yeah.
That's true. That's what I literally, I'm so happy. That does not get said enough. Like, that person is the industry plant, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of industry plants.
Yeah, there's a lot of plants.
And still, there's a reason that one
became
works
true,
and
though.
that one.
Some of them grow roots.
Yes.
That's that is always the most fascinating. I mean, that's the reason that we stay fascinated with pop music, right? Is there's this sense of they could just make it up in a lab. Mm-hmm. It's just a formula. The labels figure it out, and they're still wrong 9 times out of. They're still wrong 99 times out of 100.
They are,
and there's still some reason that people go, no, that one.
Right.
And you don't know, and it isn't like, oh, it's the best singer.
Right.
It's any number of things, but you can't make it up.
It's a perfect storm, usually.
Yeah.
It's a perfect storm of where we are culturally, what the music sounds like, how that person fits in or doesn't fit in, if that person is some level of cute or some extreme level of not cute. It's just, if they're from the It's true, though. It's like maybe they're, blowing up in the country that they were born in, or they were born in a country, but they're not blowing up in that country. They're blowing up in the like. It's everything. It's like, are we switching from counting records manually? Are we going directly? Are we counting them via SoundScan now? Are we going from SoundScan to streaming? Is MTV alive or dying? Like, all these things are going to contribute to, does a person have the right stylist? Like, what's going on with their hair? Like, does a person have the right manager? Does a person have the right road manager that gets them to Good Morning America on the time for the set that changes their life? Like, these kinds of things matter in music, which always brings me back to the fact that there is still magic in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely refuse to believe otherwise. There is no other explanation for it. I run from that word magic so often sometimes, like, because it implies that there's not, that the work isn't there, that someone sprinkled some kind of dust, or there's some kind of hocus pocus that's been going on to make a pop star, an R&B star, country star. And the work, if there's anything that I've learned from talking to so many artists and working with so many artists over the years as a music editor, is that it's actually a lot of work to be like a platinum recording artist. It's a huge amount of work and sacrifice.
That's when you look at what is the, what's the through line for the ones who really, really get there? And the answer is they work harder than everybody does.
No, but they do. They outwork everybody. But even with that being said, even with you got me working day and night, like, even with all of that, it's some magic involved.
So to close, then I'll go to questions, but to close that thought, that tease up, talk about especially your first encounters with Beyonce, because that's what you're talking about here, right?
Are you talking about the first time I met her passively, or the first time I met her actually?
Well, I mean, that sequence, as you do in the book, when we talk about A, the work, and B, the magic, this is, sort of something you kind of tease out in that story.
Yeah, it's well that you bring that up, because I don't even write a lot, spoiler alert, about Beyonce in Shine Bright. She deserves her own set of what used to be called encyclopedias. So I'm not sure exactly what you're pointing to, but I do know that I've interviewed her enough times, been on enough photo shoots with her, been to enough parties with her, been front of stage and backstage with her enough times to know that the magic to work ratio there's way more work. I have literally, we're not friends. And I'm not going to say we're in the same friend group, because that'd be really stretching it.
I'm picturing you texting that to Beyonce. We're not friends. Stop telling people we're friends, Beyonce.
We're not. But I've been around her enough, and I've been around, let's just say, the community of Beyonce enough to see the blood, sweat, and tears, man. I have too many musical references. It's like, if she's seated, it's in the eyes. She's watching, she's doing mathematical, creative calculations. I have seen her literally tell an audience that was booing, I'm lying, I wasn't there, but I have witnesses, who said she was getting booed. You remember when they couldn't figure out who Destiny's Child was going to be? And Destiny's Child was like a different group every year. And they were doing, I'm in New York, they were doing summer, what is it in New Jersey?
Summer Jam.
Summer Jam.
Summer Jam, like I didn't go 80 times. And she got out there with whatever group she was with, and they were booing her. Maybe people can't imagine Beyonce and Destiny's Child getting booed, but they were getting booed. And from what I understand, she basically blinked a few times like she's I Dream of Jeannie, somehow communicated that to her colleagues in the group with her, and they just began to sing a gospel record, a gospel song, I should say, a cappella. And Beyonce stopped in the middle and said to the effect of, "That's right, because I know y'all ain't gonna boo God." And so I say all that to say she's always working, and I think she, even still with this magnificent record that she has out now, no matter how big it is, no matter how big it is on TikTok Reels and everything else, this record even still is not. She's not getting the credit for the impact that it is having on the culture that it's having. The record is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's like, it's so good, it doesn't even begin to make sense. And I remember speaking to The Dream for Black Girl Song, the singer-songwriter, I should say songwriter-singer, The Dream, who doesn't even go by The Dream anymore. Cherry Nash, let's just go with that. And he was in the studio with Beyonce at the time when I was interviewing him about Beyonce. And I was trying so hard to get him, I know you understand, just say something like, what is it? Like, what are y'all working on? Like, and I could just see, again, it's like the magic. We're on Zoom, but I could still see it. He knew he was working on something great with one of the greatest to ever do it.
Anybody out there have any questions you want to bring? We can keep going, but I want to leave some time if you got it back there.
Do you think there's a moral issue with supporting a singer like Amy Winehouse or Bobby Caldwell or something like that, where it seems like how much that of black music?
I'll answer that to
Can
start
you
with.
just repeat the question?
Question was, is there a moral issue around supporting an artist like an Amy Winehouse or Bobby Caldwell, he mentioned, for those who very obviously are borrowing from another culture in the work?
My answer is short and sweet. It is a deeply moral issue. And I fall on the wrong side of it every single solitary time. I do. It's concurrently to me the place where there is the most crime and the most hope. And it bothers me that it doesn't go enough to the hope side of things. I don't like to get super kumbaya, but maybe I do. I really wish that we could all just kind of sing and perform and it not be like this thievery. It could just be like, Ellen, the way you were singing that song.
No one will ever say this.
It's so good. I want to sing like you. And you go, okay, do it. But then when I sing it, it just automatically matters less because I'm black and I'm a woman than when Alan sings it. That's hard for me to get past. But the thing is, I still love Alan. Therein lies the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I feel like music offers so many different kinds of pleasure and so many complicated kinds of pleasure, and one kind of pleasure that music can offer is the feeling that you're participating in resistance against a culture, a society that you consider to be deeply corrupt, right? And that pleasure of resistance has been written about a lot because music critics love resistance. But there's also the pleasure of complicity. There's the pleasure of like, this kind of feels wrong. There's the pleasure of hearing something that doesn't feel like something that you would like or should like or were expecting to like, but you like it anyway. And I think that's actually linked to what Danyel was saying about how so many of these record company schemes end up coming to grief. And so just as record companies aren't great at predicting what's going to work financially, I think we as listeners aren't great at predicting what we're going to like. And we might have certain ideas or certain principles that we think do or should rule or govern our listening lives. But then it turns out that for us, as for the executives, music is unpredictable. And so one day you're sitting at home being like, I would never listen to someone. And then the next day, like, something hits you and you're like, oh. I remember being skeptical of Eminem, and then I remember being in my apartment. I lived on Bergen Street at the time, and I can't remember if someone was coming by playing something or whatever, but I remember hearing a track and being like, oh. And I remember going to Beat Street on Fulton and buying the album. I think it wasn't even a bootleg. I think it was the real thing, and just being like, oh, I'm in. So, and I love those moments where it's something that you're not expecting. And yes, those are often deeply complicated moments.
I see you over there, but I had somebody over here. I'll come here and then there.
Yeah, this is actually really more a question from Alan. I was recently in Montreal, and what is called was the apotheosis of Leonard Cohen. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were, why Leonard Cohen, why the level of adulation, which really has made him into kind of one of the city gods. I mean, I'm wondering why, where it came from, why you thought him in particular.
Well, and I'll try and do this to loop us back into this conversation as well. I think, I wrote this crazy book about the song Hallelujah, and didn't know if I was going to be able to pull off writing a book about one song. But it's this incredible, to me, unprecedented trajectory of a song that nobody knew at all, that he turned in, and the label, speaking of the label not knowing anything, the label rejected the album, wouldn't put out the album. 10 years later, Jeff Buckley records it. A few people care, not that many people care. 10 years later, it's in Shrek, and all of a sudden people start to care. And it starts to become this crazy snowball momentum of people discovering this song without there being any definitive singular version of that song, right? Any song that's at that altitude is Imagine, or is A Change Is Gonna Come, or is Bridge Over Troubled Water, and everybody immediately got that those were big, important songs. And this one was decades later. And so people felt like they could kind of do what they wanted to do with it. If they wanted to sing certain verses, if they wanted to cut it, there's a reason that it was on in every episode of American Idol, X Factor, America's Got whatever, because you could just do, we'll just do these two verses in the chorus and get in and get out, and it's still going to have that impact. And so I was fascinated with how a song could become this global anthem out of nowhere like that. And it led to this, rediscovery of a songwriter who, the world, like a small segment of the world knew, but a lot of the world didn't know. And gave him this incredible victory lap. He went out on, it's an amazing story when somebody in their 70s is a bigger star than they ever were before in their life.
Beautiful story.
And, certainly in Montreal, it means something very specific as, the hometown. But it's wild to witness somebody like that getting recognized after many decades of sort of cult obscurity on, largely on the back of this one song that people are singing at funerals and at weddings. That's why, that was the thing that's wild, is people could find this power in that song at the saddest times and the happiest times. There was something they could plug into. That was what I wanted to write about in the book. But that sort of comes back to, a couple of things that we've been talking about in terms of labels not necessarily knowing what the hell it is that they're dealing with.
But also it's an example of this melancholy song that has this triumphant story and finally gets what it deserves. And in that case, is the opposite of the story that you tell so often in your book, Danyel, where you have these ecstatic pieces of music, and the stories behind them, or stories of songs or often of artists not getting what it seems like they deserve. And it made me wonder, there's a sense in which black music, as we think about it and listen to it, exists partly because of the segregation of American society. That's partly why it's possible to recognize this thing that's set apart from something else. That's why it's possible for Billboard to say, we're going to have a black music chart in the 1980s, right? Because music was segregated in a way that mirrored the way our country is segregated. And so I wonder, your book made me think a lot about this idea of black music not getting what it deserves. And it made me wonder whether it is possible for black music to get what it deserves in a segregated country. In other words, does the existence of black music basically ensure that it's not going to get what it deserves?
And to this, are there examples, or could there be, of that sort of belated recognition?
That black music is going to get the Cohen moment.
Or at least that there are individuals.
Or that it could be celebrated the way it should be by a country that remains, 58% non-Hispanic white.
I literally did not know I came here to solve the world's problems this afternoon.
You could say no.
I would have come with notes. Because it's not like I don't have it figured out. I just don't want to go off the head. I'm an optimist, and still I say no. I think a large part of pop coming from black people is that it is what America needs most from black people, and it shows up also in the National Basketball Association, particularly in things like the slam dunk, which is that black music so often is a performance of freedom. Like it's done. We're free, and not just free, but I hesitate to quote this song, so I won't, but I was gonna say, I believe I can fly. And I'm not even saying that with a smile. But these big, soaring pop records that just, you can think, I've written a lot about Whitney Houston singing the national anthem. It can make white Americans believe that things are okay when you are in the midst of a pop song from a black person. And then there's the crashing disappointment when that's not actually true. So that's why I say I don't think that it's possible. But I think in that moment, and that's why those records are, maybe that's why Hallelujah is, there is this suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For those 4.5 minutes. Man, tell me, you can listen to Whitney Houston sing the Star Spangled Banner, and does it not seem like just like the best, and not just the best, because Lord knows, but let's just say like that we're sort of all in this together, equally?
Right.